Hi everyone, my name is Zach, and in this video I give you a very short and quick overview about the most important render settings you have to do to either render your still image or your animation. Alright, without further words, let's get started. So before we get started, I want to give a quick shout out to RenderStreet. RenderStreet is a great online render farm where you can render your Blender projects or even Modo projects. And they supported me for this workshop by rendering all the animations for the teaser and also all the turntable animations I did for the tutorial. Also for other projects I use RenderStreet since years because RenderStreet is very easy to use, it has a great price, and they also offer this nice RenderStreet One option. That means you have to pay one monthly fee starting at $50 and then you can basically render as much as you like. So if you have a lot of stuff to render, I highly recommend to check out RenderStreet One and RenderStreet in general. Not only their service is nice and easy to use, also the customer service is top-notch. So if I had a problem or wanted to use a certain add-on which is not supported by default on this render farm, they fixed this and supported me pretty fast. Thanks RenderStreet, and now let's get to the tutorial. So first thing we have to do is to switch over to cycles, but I guess you already did this after setting up your lighting, materials and so on. And then in the render tab we find all of our render settings. For this scene I have set the ground to be a shadow catcher, as I already showed you in another video. Under the scene color management I enabled Filmic Blender. And important here, under the render layer we enable the denoising setting. That means the noise in our rendering will be removed. That means we don't need to set the render quality too high. So before we get into all the settings here, let's quickly go to File, User Preferences. And here we click on System. And then down here we find the Cycle Compute Device. Because we can either render with the CPU, the computer processor, or the GPU, the graphics card processor. So usually none is enabled. Then you either have CUDA. This will be displayed if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, or OpenCL. This will be displayed if you have an AMD graphics card. And since Blender 2.79, also AMD graphics cards are full supported as far as I know. So I have a NVIDIA graphics card, so I enable CUDA and check the GeForce graphics card here. And if you use the latest build of Blender 2.79, then you also can enable the CPU. That means you can render with the GPU and the CPU at the same time. But yeah, I will leave this for now. And then let's go to add-ons and search for the auto tile size add-on and enable this. After this, save user settings, and then let's head over to the render settings. So first of all, let's select a render border with Ctrl B, then Shift Z to render this. And now up here under render, we either can start the still frame rendering or the animation. This we will do at the end. And here we also can set the device from CPU to GPU. And if you have the CPU enabled in the user preferences, then if you have the GPU enabled, it will render using the GPU and the CPU. So, and in most cases, the GPU is much faster. So just take a look on how fast he will render using the CPU. It's pretty slow, as you can see. And now let's switch over to the GPU. This is much faster, as you can see. So the next important thing is dimensions. Here we can set up the resolution for our final image. Take care, the percentage slider here is set to 50 by default. That means it will only render half the resolution. So set this to 100 if you want to have exactly the resolution you have set up here. Then over here we can set up the frame range. That means how many frames should be rendered in our animation. And down here we can change the frame rate. That means how many frames should be rendered per video second. So right now it's 24. In Germany here it's usually 25. That means we need to render 25 images to have 1 second of video at the end. Here with this border you can disable the render border if you like, because this will also be taken in account if you hit the final render button. So let's head over to film. Here we can enable transparent. That means we have this transparent background, and if we are using an output format which supports transparent backgrounds, this will be also rendered inside the image. Then let's quickly go over to sampling. Here we have the render samples and the preview samples. So in very simple words, this means how many quality steps you will have per pixel. So if I move my camera and then hold still, you can see how this is changing from a very noisy image to a more clean image. But we will still have some noise in our image. And the higher we set the samples here, the less noise we will have. So, but it will take quite some while until we have no noise in our image anymore. And because of that, we can enable this denoising setting here in the render layer tab to remove the rest noise in our image. So we don't need to have that high samples here. A samples count of 150 to 500 is absolutely fine if you are using the denoising settings. Just test it out for yourself and see which value works. And certainly the higher you set the samples value, the longer it will render. So I leave it at 128. And the difference here is the upper value is if you press the button up here, then it will use this value. And if you're rendering in the viewport, it will take the lower value here. So then let's quickly go over to performance. We enable this auto tile size add-on because if we are rendering our image, it will render the image in these square tiles. And with this tile size, you can define how big the tiles are. And for Blender 2.79, it's the case that for rendering with the GPU, you need something about 256 by 256 to have the maximum speed. And if you're using CPU, you should use something like 32 by 32. And you don't have to care about this, just enable the auto tile size add-on, then you have this button down here, but it will be enabled by default, and then it will always use the right tile size. I have read somewhere online that in the future they set it up in a way that you don't have to care about this anymore, but yeah, for Blender 2.79 it's still the case. So this is a value which extremely influences your render time, but not your render quality. So no matter what your setup here, the render quality will always be the same, but you can save minutes to hours of render time if you use the right tile size. But yeah, simply enable the add-on and then ignore the rest. Let's hit escape to get back to our 3D viewport. And the last thing we are changing here is the output. Here we use PNG as image and we set this to RGBA, that means red, green and blue and alpha channel. Then let's set the color depth to 16-bit, and if you like, you can set up an output folder. This is only important if you want to render an animation. If you are rendering a still frame, you have to save this manually. So, and that's a very rough summary of the most important render settings. If you're done and want to render a still frame, hit the render button or press F12. And now this will render with a certain tile size and the render samples we have set up here. And also it will use the denoising setting over here. You can see it will first render the standard tiles and then a little bit later it will do the denoising. So as you can see, this took 34 seconds. This is quite okay. But yeah, if you have a sculpting with a lot of polygons, it might happen that you can't render this with your graphics card. Then you have to switch to CPU. And in most cases, this will take even longer. And yeah, if you now imagine you want to render 250 frames, I think it could be nice if you're rendering this with Render Street 1, for example. But if you have a lot of time, just let your computer render this overnight. So after I've rendered a still frame, then I want to save this. For this, I click on Image, Save as Image, navigate to the folder where you want to save this. Then down here you can change the file format and stuff like this. Let's change this to 16-bit and RGBA. Type in a name and then hit Save as Image, and then you have saved this on your hard drive. So, and this is also a turntable, as you can see. And how can we render this as animation? In actual fact, I will not change anything here. I will leave PNG enabled. That means I will render the animation in still frames. That means we have to set up an output folder. Then we click inside this folder, type in any name, underscore, and then hit accept. And now if we are clicking the animation button, it will render one still frame after another. And the benefit of rendering an animation in still frames is that you can always stop the rendering process and continue rendering from a certain frame. And nearly all of the common editing software like After Effects, Premiere, even Blender can read an image sequence as video. That means we are rendering our stuff safe. That means after every frame he's done, he will save this in a folder with the number of the frame behind this. And for example, if your computer crashes or stuff like this, you will not lose your rendering. That means if you use something from this here and then render your animation, it will render all your frames. And after it is done, it will convert this into a video. That means if your computer crashes in the meanwhile, you have to start the whole rendering process again. So yeah, I would recommend to use images for rendering an animation as well. So I pre-rendered all the images already, and now I quickly show you how you can convert this using Blender into an actual video file format, if you need this. So up here in a new Blender instance, let's go to Video Editing, go to Add, Image, navigate inside the folder where you have saved your animation, or basically all the frames of the animation, hit A to select all of them, and click off Add Image Strip. Now you can see this will be added. You can move it around using G, for example, and then you can see this is our animation here. So now I don't want to have the transparent background anymore, so I want to add a color in the background. Let's press G to move up the image strip here and add under Color, Effect Strip, a color. Let's right click on this here, press G, move it over, then right click here, G, to extend it to the full video. Then over here under Effect Strip, we can, for example, change the color to a gray here. And then let's right click on this image strip, go to Edit Strip, and the blend mode we set to alpha over. And now we can see we have this gray background. Then very important, let's split this window here, enable the properties. And here it will also use the dimension setting we have enabled here. So usually this is set to 50%, and you can see then we have a smaller image. So this has to be at 100%. And the frame rate should also be the same as our animation. So let's set this to 25. And that's basically everything. And now we only have to set the output format. In this case, I use AVJPEG with 100%, RGB, and then you have to set up an output folder. Let's call it Cute Monster Turntable, hit Accept. And when you're done, you hit Animation, and then this will be rendered from the video sequence editor. Alright, it's done with rendering, and here you can see the final video we have exported from Blender. Yeah guys, that's it with this video. Now you should have a basic overview about the most important render settings we have here in Blender, and now create some epic renderings with your dynamic topology sculptings.